Okay, so Star Wars Outlaws received a new preview this week. Lots of outlets had hands on. I think it was a remote opportunity, and then something like NVIDIA Shadowplay was used to record the footage locally on the cloud device, which was then sent to the various outlets. I want to give a shout out to Ian Higton and Jim Trinker of Gamer Network, who helped us out by supplying some footage because we weren't invited to this one, which is kind of weird. Um, in common with that preview, we also have PC specs. Oliver, why don't we talk about what you saw in the footage first? Because it's basically the closest we're going to get to the game pre-launch or pre-review period, at least.
Yeah, I think it is really important to emphasize that the footage we're seeing probably was recorded with a solution like NVIDIA Shadowplay, and it's 1080p. Also, it's probably not representative of the maxed out PC experience because we see it is using some shadow maps. There are some screen space errors in the reflection, and those probably will be cleaned up a little bit with the RTX Ti that we see and the higher end reflection options in the PC version. At least judging from Avatar, some of those things should be cleaned up a little bit,
Yeah.
like with skinned objects and the reflections and stuff like that. But it does look very good. I think a lot of the metallic interior spaces look really good. It reminded me a lot of last year's Star Wars Jedi Survivor in good ways, in very positive ways. But
Right.
here, with a much larger scope, much more open environments, much more broad interior city areas, which I think looks really cool. And that's something we didn't see a lot of in Avatar. There was a little bit of that, but mostly it was these more organic jungle type environments, not so many of the interiors. That's cool. The materials look great, GI and reflections look awesome, tons of detail in the environments, and they're lit in a really artistically interesting and compelling way. And I think the exteriors also look pretty great, which is probably what you'd expect from the studio that produced Avatar. It looks
Yeah.
very pleasing. The foliage looks good, draw distance is good, like it looks very technically accomplished in that respect. If I was to kind of poke and prod at it, I think in this preview at least, some of the third person animation doesn't look quite as good. I'm not a huge fan of the way that combat sometimes plays out visually, at least in this footage, but I think a big part of that is just the relative lack of motion blur. I think with a healthy amount of per object and camera motion blur, some of those fine movements would come together, because right now they look a little bit like staccato and they don't blend quite as well as I'd like. But I think a lot of that is just the fact that, in games like this, cinematic third person games, I'm so used to seeing lots of motion blur. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, at the
Hmm.
moment, it seems quite restrained. I think there might be some per object blur, might be turned off, turned on a per scene basis. I know that we noted that with some other previews. Could be the case that there's no camera motion blur whatsoever. Actually, I suspect that probably is the case in this footage, at least judging from like the speeder sections and stuff like that, where you should see probably some substantial camera motion blur. You're not seeing that in this case. So I hope
Yeah.
that's something that they offer at least as a toggle, because I think in Avatar it looked pretty good. I don't know why they're not leaning on that technology now, but it seems like a pretty obvious win, at least in my opinion. I like motion blur a lot, but in my opinion, will be a win for a game like
Right.
this.
Yeah, there's been some controversy about the way the game is looking and running, and I think there's a combination of factors here. But I think we are just going to be rerunning a conversation we've had in the past, where we do think that NVIDIA Shadowplay or some other internal PC solution has been used to grab the footage, which isn't optimal. And the other thing about it is, I mean, if we sort of skip through frame by frame on the footage that came out of the press previews, it's obviously dropping frames as well. So you've got this combination of two different factors that's kind of combining to make the game run in a way that I'm not sure is actually going to be indicative of the quality of the final release. And
Mm-hmm.
we've talked at length on DF Direct about how it's really important to get your marketing assets right. And yeah, there's something definitely amiss here. Now, Avatar didn't have any of these problems once you actually, went hands on with the game. So hopefully it's going to be the same here, as obviously there's a lot of commonality in the technology. Something else I noticed, and we just sort of picked up on this just before the direct, Oliver, was that all of the preview assets seen to date have been using a 21 by 9 aspect ratio to give that kind of cinematic look. But it looks like the PCs that were given to the previewers had the game set to standard 16 by 9. So I'm going to be curious to see how the console versions pan out as to what which aspect ratio they use, because there's actually been quite a lot of how can I describe it? Something that came up in the marketing was that they're looking to emulate the feel of the original trilogy movies by actually simulating the lenses that George Lucas used in that trilogy. Which obviously would be a better fit, I guess, if you're looking to mimic that with a 29:9 aspect ratio, not so much with 16, I suspect. Tom, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, there's a lot of it to echo what Oliver just said, but yeah, I mean, it is a gorgeous looking game. We've seen footage of it before, more outskirts areas in this one, which I think, for me, just shows the level of quality of the engine's ability to stream in a lot of foliage very quickly and get a real mileage on that jet bike that she's riding there. It's I still think Jedi Survivor for me personally sets the bar of quality for these sort of exploratory Star Wars games, but I've yet to see, as we said, what they've got in store for us in terms of the settings on PC, because there's there could be a lot more. I mean, we're seeing SSR, we're seeing all that stuff going on PC here, and at 1080p in this footage as well, and with frame drops. So really keen to see what it can do. The interiors look great though. You've got that baked GI, could be approximated RT, but it looks fantastic. You've got all the volumetrics there. It looks really looks the part. But
it's going to be using the same engine as Avatar, so it'll be quite a lot more dynamic than having everything baked, I suspect.
Yeah, you'd hope so.
Yeah, I think it looks fantastic. I'm just concerned about how it's going to play. And if you look at, actually, there's obviously the release of the PC specs happened as well. And initially I was thinking, wow, this is really, really heavy because, let's bring them up. Let's take a look. Basically, for the minimum specification, they're talking about a Ryzen 5 3600 paired with a GTX 1660 or an RX 5600 XT. I actually think that's kind of reasonable for a game running on a cutting edge engine. And it's not that much different to what we saw with Avatar. The 1660 isn't that much different to the 1070 that was specified for Avatar. Moving into the recommended specifications, they're talking about a 3060 Ti. They're talking about 1080p 60 there, with upscaling from, I guess, 720p. It's kind of weird with Snowdrop because they have a fixed upscaler mode and a biased upscaler mode. The biased upscaler mode actually increases the internal resolution. That's 3060 Ti for a non-native 1080p. Again, that's really heavy, but again, we saw something very, very similar with Avatar. So it's kind of a bit of a weird sort of quandary we're facing here, in that Avatar actually proved to be quite scalable if you were willing to work with upscaling. And, I had a great experience with GPUs that were worse than some of the stuff that's being mooted here for recommended PC specs. So I'm not sure whether they're being a bit cautious or whether this is genuinely a heavy game. Looking at the higher specifications here, again, this is, yes, very similar to what's happening with Avatar. The difference this time, though, is that we've got the NVIDIA GI, right, Oliver? So I would expect that it would actually be significantly heavier than Avatar.
I think it's RTX Ti. I think it's RTX Ti with this title.
Yeah.
I actually don't know that if you look at ultra settings, high settings, if those would factor in RTX Ti. It seems to me like that might be a separate setting, especially because for RTX Ti, you're going to have to update the BVH very, very frequently. Whereas these Snowdrop games are not designed around that. So it's going to be expensive. I think it's going to be pretty expensive, right? Or at least has the potential to be quite expensive. And then you have DLSS 3.5. Initially they were saying DLSS 3, but in more recent press materials, they're talking about 3.5. So there is some bespoke stuff. But I kind of think it'll be separate, honestly. I mean, I could be totally wrong here.
Yeah, I suspect it. Well, I think it does have ray reconstruction as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm hoping that. Well, here's the thing: right? Avatar didn't ship with DLSS 3. You got FSR 3, which I guess is a fine all-in-one solution for any GPU. But DLSS 3 would have been welcome. I'm kind of hoping that whatever work they've done with Outlaws here could be retrofitted to Avatar, just so it's fully feature complete with the latest technologies. What can I say? This one has been a bit tricky because I honestly think they could have done a much better job with the assets that they put out there. They don't look right, and yet what we know of this engine with Avatar, it's not a problem at all. So I don't know whether it's just a marketing issue or an assets issue, but we're going to need to go hands on with this one.
Yeah.
What I
for
would
sure.
say is that please don't use Shadowplay or any kind of internal video recording solution for your marketing assets. It's not great.
Yeah. I think, if anything, just judging from these specs, because they are so close to what we saw from Avatar, like you said, there's just a couple of differences here and there, nothing really that big. I think that probably does bode okay for the console version, because if they're talking about, same specs, if they're talking about a 6700 XT being able to pull off like 720p upscale to 1080p, that probably means maybe for the consoles, it'll be 1440p with a dynamic res there, going from like 720p to, I don't know, 1260p, whatever it was in Avatar. It might be a pretty similar experience, and I think that'll be a very solid visual experience for console owners, probably, if it does follow that same trajectory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think we just need to wait and see what the game is going to look like.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts there, Tom?
Only that it was kind of expected to see these hugely demanding specs, given that it is a current gen game in focus and it follows the trend set by Avatar, I guess. And I'm glad to see this sort of thing, that we're not being anchored to the last gen console standards, and that we can get these fundamentally more cutting edge experiences, open world experiences, which are built around that structure, kind of going. So yeah, it doesn't bother me to see those high end specs. Bring them on, I think.
Yeah, and I think in fairness, Avatar proved that it is scalable. As long as you're a bit more creative with the settings, and maybe this is being a bit conservative, but we'll just have to wait and see.